You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by John King, urban design critic at the SF Chronicle, to talk about his book, Portal, San Francisco's Ferry Building and the Reinvention of American Cities. Stay with us. Hey everybody, if you're in the Bay Area, we'll be hosting a happy hour Thursday, February 1st at 6 p.m. with the Urban Environmentalists Bay Area and Streets for People at Elixir, one of the oldest bars in San Francisco. Looking forward to seeing folks there, and check out the show notes for more information. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Happy New Year, and thanks infinitely to all the transit planners, bus drivers, advocates, and friends that support the show. To join this merry gang of zoning misfits and transit lovers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you one of our transportation scarves. We appreciate everyone's support over the last year and look forward to sharing more episodes in 2024. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Also, if you want to support the show in other ways, check out the show notes in your podcatcher or go to theoverheadwire.com to find links to our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, our Talking Headways book club shop at bookshop.org, or sign up for a 2-week free trial of our 18-year-old daily newsletter and archive. Thanks for supporting, and this year make sure to listen to this space for opportunities for happy hours, live performances, and updated information on coming attractions. Hope everyone starts 2024 out right, and now let's get back to the show. This Metro Talks was hosted by the Bay Area Regional Collaborative and was recorded in front of a live audience at the Bay Area Metro Center, which houses MTC. I want to thank Allison Brooks and the team there for helping to put together such a wonderful event. John King, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for being here. Before we get started, I should ask you if you can tell us a little bit more about yourself.
I am the urban design critic of the San Francisco Chronicle, which is a title I made up myself. I grew up in the Bay Area and grew up reading San Francisco Chronicle. Alan Timko was the architecture critic at the time. This was in the 70s and 80s when development and towers and the nature of tearing down urban neighborhoods and rebuilding urban neighborhoods was so vital and vigorous an issue in San Francisco and other cities. And Timko was really an inspiration. He was from the school of critics who stood on top of Mount Olympus just hurling down lightning bolts. And every battle was to the death or pure extolation of virtue. And when I started the Chronicle in 93, I'm a history major. I am not an architecture graduate or anything like that, but a good thing about journalism is you get to learn on the job. And so working first in Boston and then in Contra Costa and then at the Chronicle, I was able to develop my interest in cities and buildings and architecture and planning and landscape architecture, and most importantly, how all those things fit together, which is why when I took or kind of created the post I have in 2001, because Alan Timko had retired in 93, I didn't want the title architecture critic. I felt what's interesting is how the pieces fit together. And certainly that's true in transportation, which is one of the sub-themes of my book on the ferry building, is what's of interest isn't just how a particular system operates, but it's how all the different systems come together and work together or undercut each other or whatever. So that's kind of my background. And then in terms of writing a book about the ferry building, if you're writing about architecture and urban design in San Francisco, beginning in the early 2000s, I was new at this job when the ferry building reopened, and I saw how it fit the city of the time, and then saw how it kind of morphed and evolved and realized how much it's tied into how a city works. So that's what led me here tonight with Jeff.
Awesome. Well, I want to talk about the book, Portal, San Francisco's Ferry Building and the Reinvention of Cities. I've got one copy here. Let's go a little bit back in time and talk about San Francisco's waterfront specifically. I'm wondering what it looked like before the ferry building or even before most people were here.
To picture San Francisco's waterfront as it was before 1849 in the gold rush is really impossible to do in the current day. You can look at maps, but basically the shoreline ran through the foundation of the Transamerica Pyramid. Salesforce Tower, I believe, was all within the Bay. Maybe like the eastern wall just made it onto sand. Mission Creek was indeed Mission Bay, and it curled upwards in all directions and out in all directions. And essentially, San Francisco, like cities including Boston, that has a similar kind of path, you had a place and you had shallow sand and marshes around it, and then you had a city that boomed. San Francisco was essentially a sleepy hamlet on a nice little scalloped sandy bay where people just ended up. There were maybe 500 people living here in 1848. And then the gold rush was the gold rush. And this became the major port of call for everyone around the world trying to find their fortune in the gold country. And San Francisco, by 1890, when the decision was made to build the Ferry Building, it was the 8th largest city in the United States. And the shoreline had been extended pier by pier. Government was pretty fast and loose in those days. And you could pretty much just put together a few speculators, stick a wharf into the water pointing east, and then the city was happy to let you do it, and they just wanted a cut of the proceeds. And then you could kind of put buildings along it. And lo and behold, you had a bigger city. And within the first few years of doing this, there were half a dozen major fires that pretty much burned everything down, so it got put back up. And then San Francisco started to realize, and the state of California started to realize, there had to be a better way. And so the shoreline we have today comes down to a good engineer drawing a curve on a map in around 1875 and saying, why don't we do this? We'll create several hundred new acres of land, and we'll build the seawall that will lock in the dividing line. We'll backfill, that will create new real estate blocks that can be sold, by the city or by the state. And we've settled the problem, which we are now learning is not true, but it was a good run.
Well, it's interesting that whole construction of the seawall and also the politics behind some of it too, because there were some offers apparently for people that were saying, well, we'll build it for you if you give us complete control for the lifetime of this seawall.
Yes.
But it's interesting to think about it today too, of like some of the politics of the shoreline, but also the state versus city kind of push and pull too that we even still see today.
Right. Yeah, the Port of San Francisco is an autonomous fiefdom within the city of San Francisco government structure. It was transferred in the late 1960s to the city from the state. The state had taken over the port in the 1860s because what Jeff was describing, San Francisco politicians were prepared to give the waterfront and the right to develop a waterfront and put in a seawall to a consortium of a half dozen or so wharf operators. And the Board of Supervisors and the mayor waved it through despite the public being horrified and the rival wharf operators being horrified too. And it went up to Sacramento. The state senators and assembly, at that time the assemblymen, they didn't matter. They didn't care what San Francisco did, so they approved it. A Governor Downey at the time, he vetoed it and then had the state take the land back from the city. The state feeling that the Port of San Francisco is too important to the health of the California economy to be in the hands of San Francisco. So it is variations of what's going on right now with housing policy fights.
I just find it so interesting that it feels like deja vu almost. And it's still going on today where the state and the city are fighting over
definitely
topics of state importance, national importance. Well, so then what's the process like for getting to a place where we need a ferry building, a specific building in the center of it all to funnel people into the metropolis?
Yeah, the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge were built in the late 30s, but those were not what started the development of suburban communities in the Bay Area. You had suburbs feeding workers into San Francisco by the 1860s and certainly the 1870s. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about ferry history. I learned all this for the book. The first ferry to operate on the bay regularly was about 1854. So you had communities growing in Alameda, in Marin. The peninsula could come up by land, obviously, but even like Vallejo and Benicia, places like that. And so you had these ferry operators bringing people in, but then there was also everyone coming from Chicago or Boston or New York. Once the trains, crossed the Rockies and everything in the late 1860s and early 1870s, everybody who was coming from the East Coast to go to California no longer took the ship to Panama. They hopped on a train, they came all the way across, they got off in Oakland, and the train stopped in Oakland right where the ferries started, on the Oakland Mole. And so essentially, the last stop on the train line was a ferry ride into San Francisco. So you needed to have some sort of ferry building just to consolidate all the different ferry lines coming in. Also, so you could clear them away from where you were trying to build the seawall. The seawall wasn't built in an empty place with the idea of a city growing. It also took shoving people away from the shoreline to be able to build a permanent shoreline. So you had this tension that by 1890, it's like we need a real ferry building because we're having so many people coming in here.
How many people abouts were coming in at that point? I mean, I have a number for 1910, which is like 100,000 people a day were coming through the ferry building.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, I think the first year it opened, it was about half that. At the peak of service, which was around the early 30s, you had upwards of 50 million people a year coming into San Francisco through the ferry building. The city claimed that it was the second busiest transportation depot in the world, next to Charing Cross in London. So obviously it wasn't as big from the start, but it was already disproportionately big. Again, this was the 8th most populous city in the country. It had the largest working port on the West Coast, and it was the financial center of the West Coast.
And from an architecture standpoint, there's some fascinating stories you tell in the book, too, about how it was designed and some of the innovative ways that it still exists.
It's funny. We think of the ferry building as this wonderful old landmark on the water. It's 125 years old this year and things. But it was a symbol of modernity in San Francisco. And it was a badge of pride of San Francisco of, we are a city pushing into the future. That was the play, not look at our wonderful past. And so the foundation of the building essentially is 5,100 or so pine tree trunks. The trees were cut down in Oregon. They were cleaned off. They sailed out of Coos Bay. They headed south. The first big barge to leave Coos Bay hit a storm, sunk, capsized, flipped over. The monster raft is what the Examiner called it. Flipped over. All those logs just floated off to who knows where. So you had all these things, 80-foot-long trunks of Oregon pine. They were driven into bay mud. They were not driven down to bedrock. It was just drive them into the mud, drive them below the mud, which is why they've survived, because they haven't been exposed to air or water since they went in a steady pressure. And you had like an open box at the top of each tree trunk. And it was a square box. You filled it with concrete, and then when the concrete dried, you broke off the wood, and you now had a base to build catacomb-like arches that interconnected, because the piles were often bundled together under the weight of support. This was all worked out by the engineer for the port. And then they just poured a lot of concrete on top, and that was the foundation. So it's a very simple foundation, which had problems once the building was moving into its current incarnation, since not only is there no basement in the building, there's no underpinning. Like if you want to drop wiring into this floor, you just lift up the panel by me and you drop it down. To put in, like if you were putting in the slanted door restaurant, to run the piping necessary for that, They had to drive through the concrete, and the pipes are all underneath the concrete foundation, running along the catacombs below it. So it was definitely ahead of its time, but that's kind of how it works. So you just had this big flat concrete table, and then you built a 600-foot long 3-story building on top of it. And then in the middle of that building, you put a 245-foot clock tower. And bingo. The seawall stops at the east end of the ferry building. So there's no seawall that goes out to protect the ferry building. It's all sitting on wooden piles.
Another thing I found really interesting, you're talking about the catacombs underneath and how to drive pipes underneath, you have to go under. The idea that people who are putting in pipes for Cowgirl Creamery or whatever it is have to go still on a boat underneath the ferry building at low tide to actually fix something is still amazing to me.
Yeah, I chickened out because I was offered, because the boats are going under all the time, and an engineer whose office is in this ferry building we're sitting in, he was kind of showing me diagrams and explaining how it worked, and he said, in a month or so we've got to go in to do some testing. You're welcome to come along. And my official excuse to myself was that, well, I'm not going to fit it into the book. It doesn't really work. I need to focus on getting the book done. But there is definitely the kind of claustrophobia person in me who is like, that just sounds too creepy.
How many tools are at the bottom of underneath the ferry building?
No one knows. If you were to go out in king tides, you could when they go in the super low tides, you could probably find a few. Yeah, there's a great quote in the book where an architect who worked on some of the interiors during the restoration of the building in 2001 and 2 was saying they'd send people in rowboats underneath, and sometimes the rowboats, they'd flip over and we'd lose the tools. Sometimes we'd lose the workers. So presumably they then came back, but it's the notion that something that low tech still is being done in this 21st century age is pretty crazy.
From an architecture standpoint as well, I'm also curious about the comparisons to other kind of city entry buildings like train stations. And at the time, the robber barons and other folks were building these ornate train stations in East Coast cities, but the ferry building was where people came in San Francisco. And so there was a comparison made between the two.
Yeah, if you go back into the architectural literature of the late 19th century, there were articles comparing, that the cathedrals of yesterday are the train depots of today. They are the buildings that define the city, that mark the city, that are the symbol of the city. So with the ferry building here in San Francisco, there's no need for the clock tower. The clock tower is not there so that somebody at Front and California Street can know what time it is. The clock tower is there so boats pulling in, people can be suitably impressed by the city they are entering. And from the city side, it's so that people can see the building that marks the shoreline, that marks this building stands between us and the thing that made us. We are a port city. So it was very much a conscious decision. Last thing really quick is that Jeff's right. If you go to the train depots, like a Grand Central Station, for instance, or Union Station in Cincinnati or something, the details are incredible. But those are because those were private companies trying to one-up their competitors. The ferry building was a state building built on a state-approved budget. So the architect, Arthur Page Brown, very smartly did all these big, gorgeous moves. But the details themselves are pretty straightforward. It was not a building intended to make you gasp at the tile work and things like that. It was more, it wowed you with the arches marching along the Embarcadero, or just the telescoping of the clock tower as it rises into the air. Very smart design.
But the tile work still is pretty impressive.
The tile work is impressive, but anyone who's been inside Grand Central Station, that stuff goes way beyond impressive.
It reminds me of also the start of the book where you talk about the 1906 camera ride. And I imagine most folks in this room have seen that YouTube video where there's a camera a couple of days before the earthquake, and seeing the ferry building in the distance is reassuring to a certain extent, knowing what's coming
Absolutely.
in a couple of days.
Absolutely. Everything along Market Street would disappear or just become a burned out hulk, but the Ferry Building stayed.
You followed San Francisco history for quite a while. I'm wondering if there's anything kind of new you learned in the process of writing this book.
I learned lots of new things. I mean, one thing about being a journalist, even if you're a journalist who's a history major, is that you're focused on the present or you're focused on the past as it directly relates to the present. That's one reason I ended up writing about the Ferry Building. I got so interested in kind of past stories. But in writing the book, I was fascinated at a number of things, starting with I was surprised at how thoroughly society embraced automobiles, just without question. And I don't mean this from a 21st century cars are bad because of climate change and things, but just if you look at something like the Embarcadero Freeway, which became the symbol that in tandem with the Ferry Building triggered the freeway revolt in San Francisco and, kind of encouraged freeway revolts across the country, there was no opposition to the idea of networks of elevated freeways going into San Francisco after World War II because every city was doing it, because everyone now felt they either had a car or they felt they were entitled to have a car. And if you have a car, the beauty of a car compared to, say, a ferry is you don't need a schedule and you don't need a certain set route. You are your own commander. You can go wherever you want, whenever you want. Everything's convenient. So the idea of just crisscrossing San Francisco with all of these elevated freeways, all of these open-air freeway cuts going through the city, it was very uncontroversial initially. I mean, there are transit studies from the late 30s and the late 40s that read like military manifestos, that gridlock is killing our city, we need to have a sustained campaign to crush it, and so it's elevated freeways. And it was only when the Embarcadero Freeway started going up and people saw what it was doing to their notion of the water and to their vision of the Ferry Building that just seemed like their birthright almost, that people started to really question the larger notion of, is getting from point A to point B more important than everything else connected with what makes a city work? So that was one thing that surprised me. The other thing that surprised me, and I knew this in a general sense, but we forget how the Bay Area was so tied to the military, how important it was as a military place for the United States, certainly up until and through World War II. The Ferry Building, once the bridges went up in the 30s, it was obsolete functionally. I mean, obviously it wasn't obsolete as a symbol of urban vitality and affection, as we learned in the coming decades. But in a transit sense, if everybody just wanted to be on a car, and they rode the Key Line into San Francisco on the lower deck until they could afford a car, they did not care about the ferries. The ferries pretty quickly drifted off to Southern Pacific, still had one going back and forth. But during World War II, the Ferry Building came back to life, partly because the USO used the upper area, the nave, the whole grand open hall. That was like a place where soldiers on leave in San Francisco could stay. So they'd be bunking and things like that while they had like a weekend in San Francisco. And the ferries themselves were brought back to life because the workers would go from San Francisco to Richmond or to Marin City or down to Alameda or out to Mare Island, because this was a major hub of World War II. One of the things I enjoyed about research in the book is just really fleshing out how the region came to be and all the different lives the region has lived.
And kind of that car orientation that you're talking about goes all the way back to the 1915 Panama Pacific
Yes, that was a surprise, that incident.
International Exposition, because I didn't know this, but Henry Ford set up a small assembly line in the marina.
Yes, so you had the Panama Pacific International Exposition, which is remembered for, the Palace of Fine Arts and very much all this kind of nostalgia seeped looking back to a Pacific tradition that did or didn't exist. But it also had like kind of a hall of machinery or whatever. And as Jeff was saying, Henry Ford set up a small assembly line within the 1915 World's Fair that was assembling cars that were then sold. And it took like 60 minutes or something like that. And so we had this factory, and then one day of the fair was Thomas Edison Day. So they were celebrating the creator of electricity there, which I would guess is something a few months in to spur the attendance or something. But so Henry Ford gave Thomas Alva Edison a tour of the assembly line, and he was pointing it out with pride and telling Edison how in Detroit he had lines that worked even faster than this and things, and wasn't it impressive? And Thomas Edison looked and just said something like, "Soon they will begin to spawn." So that was Thomas Edison predicting what automobiles would shortly do to America. And I very quickly give praise to my editor at W.W. Norton, Tom Meyer, because I had a much different, snippier journalistic ending to that particular chapter. And he was kind of, well, go find some more information about the World's Fair. Does it relate to the ferry building and cars at all or does it relate to what was coming with the bridges in any way? And when I found that in some book or newspaper search, it made me think occasionally editors are right.
Well, that's a good point too, is like, when did the Golden Gate Bridge become a usurping symbol of San Francisco over the ferry? Because for the longest time, people associated the ferry building with San Francisco. It was the thing on postcards. It was the thing that people knew of the city. And so how fast did the Golden Gate Bridge take over?
If you go back to early 20th century popular culture, the ferry building was the calling card for San Francisco. And if you saw any movie set in San Francisco in the 1920s or 30s, including the first Maltese Falcon movie, which was 1931 or something like that, it opens with a shot of the ferry building from the bay, saying, "This is San Francisco." It is. Look at the building. The equivalent of the shot now, that's an aerial shot curving in above the Golden Gate Bridge toward the skyline. And the Golden Gate Bridge pretty much became the icon of the city the day it opened. I mean, the Golden Gate Bridge was so beautiful. It was so much a triumph of the modern era. And the ferry building by then, the Bay Bridge had opened about 6 months earlier, so it was already obvious what was happening to the ferry building. So it was like flipping a switch.
From not just a car standpoint, but also from a maritime standpoint, it's interesting to see that kind of parallel between also the idea of containerization too, because the cars took over as the main form of transportation, but the port changed because of the containerization of cargo.
Yes.
And so before that, it was mostly men taking apart ships from the longshoremen, basically taking apart ships, and then the containerization changed the fortunes of the waterfront as well.
Yes, and the subtitle of the book is San Francisco's Ferry Building and the Reinvention of American Cities, because a lot of the changes seen in San Francisco are directly paralleled by other large, older American cities. And one is the trajectory of urban ports, as Jeff was talking about. San Francisco has saved more finger piers than other cities on the water by a long shot, because we love history. But every big waterfront city used to have a lot of these narrow piers sticking out. And then as the ships got bigger, as containers started to become the way of, the beauty is that the old way, economic beauty, the old way of doing it is workers are lugging stuff in and out of the ships, and those finger piers were used for storage as much as anything else, because you'd be spending the week amassing everything that's then going to be put on the next ship to pull in. And once that stuff is put on and the stuff is taken off, then you've got to get rid of that. With containers, you just fill the containers in wherever they happen to be, and then you just lift the container up with a crane, you drop it onto a truck, and you drop it onto a ship. So that's why it works the way it does. And those ships were too big and too heavy to slip into a traditional waterfront. So San Francisco in the 50s was still trying to modify the Embarcadero, but it was pretty clear by the end of the 50s that the Embarcadero's day as an economically viable urban port were finished.
And then the highways come, and the Embarcadero Freeway kind of, as you mentioned earlier, gave residents kind of a taste of what their freeway future would look like.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it just was there are a fair number of you in here who look fairly young who would not remember the Ferry Building. I grew up when it was primarily a way to come in from UC Berkeley to clubs in North Beach at night and then zip home, and it was kind of a fun ride. But, you had a double-deck concrete viaduct, 60 feet high, no architectural grace, and it was wide, probably 5 lanes wide, covering what now is the Embarcadero Boulevard, where the streetcars run and things like that. And so that was like a wall cutting off more than a mile of the waterfront. And then behind it, you had the Ferry Building, and you had a ferry building that was sparsely occupied, and it was kind of cheap office space in various ways, and it had air conditioners sticking out of windows. The front facade looked about the way it does now, but the sides had been completely torn off and like restripped with modern band windows and things like that. And so you had this it was literally the wrong side of the tracks. And that's just how it functioned. Oh, and there was still a freight rail running north and south on the Embarcadero, which had been put in the early 1900s and survived into the early 1980s.
So if the ferry building and it was cut off by the Embarcadero Freeway, why was it so hard then to get people to vote to tear it down?
I knew this dimly, but I had forgotten about it. In 1986, San Francisco voters were asked if they wanted to tear down the Embarcadero Freeway and replace it with a surface boulevard. And a little context, quote unquote, everybody hated the Embarcadero Freeway. From the day it went up, you had the Chronicle saying it should be torn down. You had Board of Supervisors and planning commissions passing non-binding resolutions to tear it down. It was just everybody hated the Embarcadero Freeway. Then Dianne Feinstein put together a plan. She got the Board of Supervisors to back her. She was mayor then. And all the regional agencies, all the agencies in this building, to go along with the idea. And so it was smooth sailing. The money was there supposedly to take down the freeway and move the traffic onto the surface streets. And voters rejected the idea by more than 60%. It was not a close election. It was just a total defeat of the idea. And a lot of it was convenience. You had people who just thought, yeah, but it's so much more convenient to ride it. And then San Francisco in 1986 was going through all sorts of development battles. And so opponents of Feinstein effectively used the argument, if we tear down the freeway, we'll just get a bunch of developers building a bunch of towers. And that's what's going to happen. And once that election occurred, the whole question of taking down the Embarcadero Freeway seemed settled once or for all until the Loma Prieta earthquake came around.
The echoes are interesting because the progressive supervisor that basically said not to tear it down because it was a giveaway to developers, I feel like that kind of echoes today, just like the state fights with the city over the waterfront kind of echo today's housing discussions as well.
Exactly. If you allowed this to happen, it'll just be a bunch of market rate housing built. And obviously issues are complex and there are valid things on both sides, but very, very simplistic.
So between the 1989 earthquake and today in the 1990s and early 2000s, the building got a revamp. it feels like the building at that point is kind of living its best life.
One of the things that's interesting, the Ferry Building that we know today is totally different than the Ferry Building that opened in 1898. The architectural shell is the same. Historic features such as the grand nave have been restored very well. That was filled with offices for 50 years. I mean, both wings had been, whole floors of offices had been put in, the skyline had been covered over, or the skylights had been covered over. You can't conceive what it was like. And unlike today, when ferries pulled in, you didn't get off the ferry and walk on the land. You pulled directly into the ferry building and you stepped out and walked through like you were walking into an airplane terminal. It was connected pieces walking in. That stuff had been torn off long ago or burned down long ago and replaced and all. So you have this totally different building that was then restored and recreated. And today's building functions not so much as a transportation hub, though it does have the ferries, but it's totally in sync with the 21st century San Francisco, very organic, very committed to different sorts of cuisines, the idea of public access, the wonderful walkway between the structure and the water, that was just built in the early 2000s as part of the project. Before that, there were boilers sticking out of the back of the Ferry Building. There was no place to walk back there. The Ferry Building embodies so much of today's San Francisco or 21st century San Francisco. It is a building that is rooted in the past, but it's showing off present-day values. And in that way, it's in sync just as much as the 1898 Ferry Building was in terms of this is the portal showing San Francisco is a true American city.
It also feels like over its lifespan, it's also kind of reflected what cities were going through in the United States too. You had kind of an up period through the Second World War, and then you had a down period, and then you have kind of a rebirth of cities. Mm-hmm. And the Ferry Building seems to have matched that timeline overall together.
That's true. And it's especially true because every big American city has that wonderful building that people didn't know what to do with after its relevance seemed to have passed. Some cities tore them down. Penn Station was torn down in New York City, and that was so controversial it spurred the national preservation movement. The Stock Exchange in Chicago with, gorgeous Louis Sullivan ironwork and things, and Frank Lloyd Wright worked on it. That got torn down. And now the artifacts are sold off and shown in museums. The Ferry Building was lucky in a way because it was protected by the Embarcadero Freeway. There were proposals to take it down, and the initial proposal, which would have replaced it with a 40-story tall modern shaft that would hold a World Trade Center in 1949, it was supported by all politicians across the board, but it made no sense economically, so it never got anywhere. But once the freeway went up, the way the Ferry Building was stranded made it stronger as a symbol of what was at stake in terms of the urban values of San Francisco. So it didn't go through a lot of changes that might have messed it up. And it was able to draw on the best examples of urban revitalization in the 70s and 80s and learn from the mistakes of those eras. Obviously it dodged urban renewal with just tear things down, but then it also dodged some of the tackier aspects of festival marketplaces and things like that, or something that would have added like taller buildings to the back of it and things.
There was a specific design by I.M. Pei that was fairly, I think maybe at the time it might have looked good, but now it would look very, I'm just going to say bad. It just looks bad.
Yeah, I.M. Pei, who, very much a great architect. He and his office were hired to work on a development proposal at the end of the 70s. I think it was released in the early 80s. And they restored the shell of the building, and they brought back the skylight, and everybody was happy as could be initially. But basically, they kept the front of the building, restored it very faithfully, but then attached a multi-story terraced office building in back stepping down to the water, which looked like a lot of other IMP projects at the time. The interior was turned into an open-air shopping mall that had the bulbed glass storefronts that were very 1980s. And the skylight wasn't just restored. You know, if you were to walk into the nave today, you see this nice narrow skylight at the peak of the trusses. Essentially, the entire roof became a skylight. And then a big chunk of the back wall became a skylight. So you turned it into a temple of light or something like that. And so it would have kept the front as an artifact, and it would have stuck an entirely different creature into it, like a hermit crab. You know, you've got the shell and then something else climbs inside. Yeah, and initially it was very popular because IMP was doing it. But with time, many things proposed for the ferry building and the Embarcadero just broke down under their own weight with the passage of time, and this was one of them.
Which makes the redesign of today's ferry building really interesting. You think about that IMP design where interior, you would have these kind of store bulbs the windows would stick out from the stores and you'd have to enter the store. But now you walk down there and all of the stores kind of come at you in a vibrant way. And so I find that really interesting too, that little design choice that made the ferry building kind of what it is today.
Yeah, the developer of the ferry building, Wilson Meany Sullivan, put together a good design team in making the bid for the project. But then when they got the project, the developer, Chris Meany, took the lead architects of the different firms with him to Europe to investigate market halls of Europe. So they went to London and Paris and Milan and Venice, which makes me wish I had become an architect. But they came back with very specific ideas that they can tell you specific antecedents that shape the interior in terms of just how the ground floor feels. And it's just things like, you know, not having glassed-in spaces, but having these grated entries that open and close and pull down was just to give it more of a street-like feel and to not have kind of the hermetic distinction between inside and out. And it worked really well.
So on the horizon, we have, or here already, climate change. We already have king tides, obviously. But is the ferry building up for it?
The next year or two are going to be really fascinating in San Francisco because since 2016, there have been a procession of very serious studies about the stability of the seawall, which, remember, was built in the late 19th century and very kind of haphazardly built, and, you know, sea level rise. You know, earthquakes plus sea level rise is not a good prognosis for the future of the waterfront or the ferry building. The ferry building is seen as so valuable that the port officials say there is no chance they would see that as something that's allowed to become obsolete or derelict. But it becomes, do you raise the building up? There's a study going on right now on purely in terms of engineering, is it feasible to do that? And if it was determined to be, that's a whole separate set of issues in terms of the finances and politics. There is also a question of, do you build a breakwater that essentially, do you seal off portions of the Embarcadero to keep water from coming in? But would the ferry building have its allure if it was sitting on a lake with a concrete walkway, 100 yards to the east? And then the entire Embarcadero, if you're going to, you need to rebuild the seawall or at least strengthen it, the one that exists now. And that's pretty definitively shown by engineering studies. You should raise it up a few feet because of sea level rise. But how on earth do you do that? You don't want to just build a wall and wall off the bay from the city. So you could think, well, what we could do is slope the Embarcadero roadway up and create the promenade a whole few feet higher. But obviously then you've got the problem with every pipe underground, every sewage line underground, tearing up the Embarcadero for who knows how many years and things like that. And the Army Corps of Engineers has been working with the city on a study, and the Army Corps is supposed to release its report by February that will do a draft set of recommendations on how to deal with the San Francisco waterfront. And my guess is it'll cause a lot of outrage and a lot of protests, but it will get the conversation moving from we need to be concerned to so what are we going to do about it?
I have two more questions for you, then I'm going to open up for questions from the audience. But how do we keep the Ferry Building as an icon in the future going forward? How does it remain an icon for the city?
I think the Ferry Building will always be an icon for the city because it's in an iconic location. It's where Market Street meets the water. You just see the Embarcadero coming up. In a very real way, the Ferry Building is where so many people begin their day in San Francisco. They meet at the Ferry Building and they decide are they going to go north or south. It's going to be iconic because the farmers market, which is a separate entity but has become inseparable with the notion of authenticity, has to stay. I'm sure the developer would see more profitable things to do, but realistically, they also know if they did that, they'd be killing the goose that makes them authentic. It's so visible, it's so dramatic, it's tied in, water traffic is more and more a factor, not what it was in the early days, but it is a very legitimate thing. So I think just the power of its presence ensures that in various ways it will be an icon. It is not a building that will have once been an icon like the Palace Hotel. It is very likely to be an icon when it turns 250, if we're lucky enough.
And then the last question I have, you've talked about this book a fair amount since it came out, and you've done a number of interviews. I'm wondering if there's a question that you haven't been asked.
At this point, I feel like I've been asked an awful lot of questions. I guess what I haven't been asked, just kind of thinking off the top of my head, would be, why didn't I go more into the subject the person asking me questions cared about the most? Because I was not aiming for an 800-page book. I was aiming for a 250-page book. And I have gotten a hint. Someone who really loves ferry boats will say there's not enough on that. Someone who really is interested in how the building came back to life in the 21st century. And the people who took part in that are still alive and active. I've definitely gotten questions, not from interviewers, but from people just, why didn't you put in da-da-da-da-da? That was a really spicy tale. And it's like, well, it is to you and 8 friends of yours, but not to the general reader. And I am fascinated by its role as a popular culture symbol, like in movies and things. And I skimmed a lot of bad movies and a lot of bad TV shows, looking for the references, taking notes on the references, and everything pretty much fell out except for it came from beneath the sea with the hydrogen-powered octopus that pulled down the tower. Couldn't resist that.
It's interesting. At the time, I guess the Ferry Building was the thing to tear down. Now that everybody takes down the Golden Gate Bridge.
They took down the Golden Gate Bridge too. Now it's the Transamerica Pyramid.
And then the cover of the book is actually some pop culture as well, right?
Yes. The cover of the book, which was dreamed up by an in-house designer at W.W. Norton, bless him, takes its inspiration from crate art of the 1930s. There was the Merrill Packing Company in Salinas had a line of produce, Frisco Vegetables, and the owner of the company, Mr. Merrill, wanted to have something on the crate art that would tell you this is San Francisco. This is Frisco. Here's a building that says Frisco, and our letters say Frisco. And Mr. Merrill chose the Ferry Building. And I talked to his grandson, who still owns the company. It's still the family-owned Merrill Packing in Salinas. And yeah, his grandfather explained that, well, that was San Francisco at the time. And in the 50s, the actual crates were dying. You had boxes now, but they decided to freshen their look. So the symbol for the Frisco line in the 50s until they discontinued it in the early 60s, you had the Ferry Building still, but you also had the cable car. So they shook things up by bringing the cable car in.
All right, well, I'm going to open up to questions. If folks have questions, raise your hand and I'll call on you. So there's a question about the architecture and how it's evolved and where it came from.
The original architect, A. Page Brown, the architect of the Ferry Building, did go to Europe on kind of a tour to look at train depots and various buildings of note. It was not explicitly modeled on any building, or if it was, he never said that. Very much looks like the clock tower you're talking about. On the other hand, there weren't that many models to choose from. I mean, that seems to be the cleanest connection. But at the time, you wanted to do the gesture. This was the City Beautiful movement. You wanted big arches, you wanted masonry, you wanted a certain kind of robust dignity, and you wanted a clock tower, so you kind of did the stripped down streamlined tower. He was accused of plagiarizing McKim, Mead & White, the firm he started with, for a tower on Madison Square in New York. That also kind of looks like the tower in Seville. But how many big clock towers could you pull from in Europe at the time? It's that, or it's St. Mark's in Venice. So you've got.
That's Cal.
There we go. So you only had like that and Big Ben. You've got 3 to work from.
There was a question about the chimes.
That's one of the things I left out of the book. Yeah, the clock was a working clock. I mean, it's still working. I think it's turned off now because there was the scaffolding up to repaint the tower that just came down in November. But it always was a working clock tower. It also had a siren that went off 3 times a day, very loud. And that, I think, went into the 60s or so. But I didn't find any lore in terms of using the clock tower and the chimes to send out certain signals. It was more just a very basic signaling, I think, the hour and the half hour.
So would a change of place for Market Street or a location for Market Street changed the design?
Yeah, San Francisco is very much an accidental city. In the 1840s, a Swiss engineer platted out like an 8-block grid at the request of the local leaders. I mean, I think this is before it was part of the United States, before the Mexican-American War. And then there was kind of a realization that his platting would hit Nob Hill and Russian Hill, which at that time could not be scaled because the cable cars didn't exist. So we needed another plat. So then a different engineer ran a diagonal kind of at the angle. And so Market Street was created as where the 2 grids collided. So if they had collided in a different place, the Ferry Building would be in a different place because it was deliberately placed to be at the axis of the waterfront and Market Street.
Awesome. And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast, and you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.